dad had just accepted his 35-year dedication watch when he shoved me to the hardwood floor before the entire ballroom. Pointing to the chair beside him, he declared, "That seat is for my real daughter." The guests froze, assuming this was merely a humiliating spectacle. They had no idea my husband stood in the back, gripping a file that would destroy my father's marriage, stop a fraudulent house sale, and expose my stepmother for who she really was. My name is Sophia Whitaker. I am 34 years old, and tonight was supposed to be a celebration of a lifetime of hard work. The Cape Fear River rushed silently outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the most exclusive riverfront hotel in Wilmington, North Carolina. Inside the grand ballroom, hundreds of crystal teardrops dripped from the chandeliers, casting a warm, forgiving golden light over the region's elite. I had chosen to wear my mother's midnight blue silk dress for the occasion. Eleanor Whitaker had worn this exact gown to her own 10th wedding anniversary dinner. Slipping it on earlier that evening had felt like wrapping myself in a fragile layer of armor, a desperate attempt to bring a tangible piece of her spirit into a room that I deeply suspected would try its hardest to forget her. The first glaring warning sign hit me the moment my husband Daniel and I stepped through the heavy double oak doors of the ballroom. The official seating chart was written in swirling gold calligraphy on a massive antique mirror in the foyer. I ran my finger down the alphabetical list of guests once, and then twice. My name was completely missing. Yet there, placed right at the very top under the diagram for the head table, was the name Maren Mercer, my stepmother's daughter. She was seated directly next to my father, Warren Whitaker. Before I could point the humiliating omission out to Daniel, my stepmother materialized from the bustling crowd of guests. Celeste Mercer Whitaker glided toward us like a shark in a sequined silver gown. She wore a smile so perfectly polite, so ruthlessly practiced, that it made the bottom of my stomach turn cold. "Sophia, darling, you actually made it," Celeste said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth meant for the surrounding guests to hear. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she placed a heavily manicured hand on my forearm, her sharp nails digging slightly into the blue silk, and physically steered Daniel and me away from the bright center of the room. "We had a slight mix-up with the catering numbers this morning, but do not worry at all. I found a lovely little spot for you two," she lied effortlessly. Celeste led us away from the floral centerpieces and the glowing candles of the main dining floor. She guided us to a small, wobbly table tucked away in the darkest back corner of the ballroom, pushed tightly against the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Waiters rushed past us in a frantic blur, bringing the heavy smell of roasted beef and the sharp clatter of dirty silverware. We were seated like last-minute afterthoughts. We were positioned exactly like uninvited strangers crashing a private family event. I tried to swallow the massive lump forming in my throat as the ballroom lights slowly dimmed. The cheerful clinking of silver forks against fine porcelain quieted down to a respectful hush. A massive projection screen rolled down over the main stage for my father's highly anticipated tribute video. The bold white title flashed across the screen, 35 years of dedication. The slideshow started beautifully with grainy black and white photos of the old factory floor, moving proudly through the decades. There were pictures of my father with his earliest colleagues, laughing joyously at company picnics and holding up dusty bowling trophies. Then came the recent years, and the story on the screen violently shifted. Endless, brightly colored vacation photos of him and Celeste on tropical cruise ships filled the room. And then came the ultimate, systematic erasure of my bloodline. The screen flashed picture after picture of Maren hugging his shoulder at a Christmas party, Maren toasting him at his birthday dinners, Maren standing proudly next to him on the wooden front porch of the exact house I grew up in. There was not a single photograph of me in the entire presentation. More painfully, there was not one single image of my mother, Eleanor, the woman who had faithfully built his life and his foundation with him from the ground up. The final slide faded to black, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence trapped inside my chest. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the glowing center microphone, his booming voice echoing off the high acoustic ceilings. And now, please welcome Marin Mercer to the stage for a special toast. I stopped breathing. Marin stood up gracefully from the center of the head table. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and accepted the roaring, standing applause of the room as if it were her absolute, undeniable birthright. She beamed out at the crowd, her eyes shining with a fake, perfectly practiced devotion. I could not sit in the shadows anymore. The midnight blue silk of my mother's dress rustled sharply against my legs as I forcefully pushed my chair back. Daniel reached out a steady hand to grab my wrist, but I was already moving forward. I walked straight across the center of the crowded ballroom. The loud applause for Marin began fading into a confused, rippling murmur as hundreds of people noticed my solitary march toward the head table. I had been practically cut out of my father's life for 3 long, agonizing years. I had been relegated to unanswered text messages, filtered phone calls, and locked doors. I just wanted a brief, honest conversation. I wanted him to look at me in front of all these people and acknowledge that I actually existed. Warren stood up from his chair as I approached the elevated platform. The warm, nostalgic smile he had worn during the entire slideshow vanished completely. His eyes were unusually cold, completely hollowed out, as if he were looking at a hostile stranger who had come to collect a massive debt. I reached out, my fingers trembling just slightly under the chandeliers, and placed my hand firmly on the thick wooden back of the empty chair right next to him. "Dad, I need to speak to you," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears and years of repressed anger. I did not even get to finish my thought. He moved with a sudden, violent jerk that defied his age. His large hand struck my shoulder, violently shoving me backward away from the table. The sheer force of the unexpected push sent me stumbling awkwardly over the heavy hem of my mother's gown. I hit the polished hardwood floor incredibly hard. The sharp physical impact radiated straight up my spine, echoing through the sudden, dead, horrifying silence of the ballroom. Warren pointed a shaking, furious finger down at the empty chair I had touched. His voice boomed through the quiet ballroom, raw, cruel, and completely unapologetic. "That seat is for my real daughter." The entire room froze in a collective gasp. No one moved a single muscle. No one dared to breathe. In those few agonizing seconds of massive public humiliation, the delicate metal clasp of my small evening clutch snapped open upon hitting the floor. The heavy brass key to Eleanor's old house spilled out. It slid rapidly across the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic ring, spinning until it finally came to rest right at the tip of my father's polished leather shoe. It was a tiny, shining sign. It was a solitary artifact of the truth lying between us, though no one else in that grand room understood its massive legal weight yet. My husband, Daniel Cross, did not rush forward to scream in defense of my honor. He did not throw a wild punch or cause the hysterical, emotional scene that Celeste was undoubtedly hoping and praying for. Daniel is a man built on precise, lethal logic. He walked up to the head table slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic sound of his leather dress shoes cutting through the absolute, breathless silence of the crowd. He stopped right beside me, gently but firmly, helping me to my feet, without ever taking his dark, calculating eyes off my father. Daniel calmly adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white dress shirt. Then, he reached smoothly inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thin, dark leather folder. He held it out into the open air, not as a frantic threat, but as a cold executioner calmly presenting a death warrant. He looked dead at Warren, his facial expression perfectly composed, and asked in a chillingly calm voice that somehow carried easily to every single hidden corner of the room. "Sir, did you ever sign away half of Eleanor's house? To understand the sheer cruelty of that night at the hotel, you have to understand the deep, unbreakable foundation that was destroyed. Before the lies, before the polished hardwood floors and the corporate banquets, there was just an old, weather-beaten wooden house on the edge of the historic district in Wilmington. That house was not just a structure of timber and iron nails. It was the physical, living manifestation of my family. My mother, Eleanor, was the absolute soul of that property. She was a public school music teacher with a bright, ringing laugh that could fill a concert hall and a heart that held on to absolutely everything. She kept meticulous, handwritten diaries of every single repair the house ever needed, noting the exact day a pipe was fixed or a floorboard was replaced. She painted the heavy wooden mailbox by hand every single spring, choosing a different shade of bright yellow or soft blue. She was the one who insisted on hanging the heavy wooden swing on the front porch, the one that groaned with a familiar, comforting rhythm every time the humid coastal wind blew. Sunday evenings were her sacred ritual. She would bake her famous summer peach pie, the rich scent of melting butter and caramelized fruit wrapping around the downstairs hallway, while old jazz records spun endlessly on a vintage turntable. She made the house breathe. My father, Warren Whitaker, was a completely different kind of force. He was never a man of grand, sweeping emotional declarations. He did not write poetry or offer long, tearful speeches about love. His affection was entirely practical, rooted deeply in the dirt and the wood and the sweat of maintaining the life he had built with my mother. Instead of simply telling me he loved me, he taught me how to replace the rusted brass hinges on a sticking wooden door. He taught me how to change the heavy metal tumblers in a deadbolt lock. He showed me how to run my bare hands over a seemingly smooth oak floorboard and feel the invisible, creeping warping caused by the heavy North Carolina humidity. "Listen to the wood, Sophia," he used to tell me, his rough, calloused hands guiding mine along a doorframe. "It will always tell you when something is fundamentally wrong." Those quiet, dusty afternoons in the garage and the hot attic were his way of giving me the world. They were the exact moments that shaped my entire future. Because of him, I did not just see old buildings as decaying, useless structures. I saw them as living histories that desperately needed to be saved. That deep, ingrained reverence for the past is exactly what led me to become a historical preservation architect at Thorn and Vale Urban Studio. I built my entire professional career on the solid foundation of the lessons he taught me in that house. I spent my life saving other people's foundations because he taught me exactly how to value my own. I remember one specific summer afternoon when a massive coastal hurricane threatened to tear through Wilmington. While the rest of the neighborhood was frantically slapping cheap plywood over their modern windows, my father and I spent hours carefully reinforcing the original, heavy wooden storm shutters. We worked in perfect synchronized silence, the warm, heavy rain already beginning to lash violently against our faces. When the massive storm finally passed, leaving broken tree branches and flooded streets in its wake, our house stood completely untouched. My father placed his hand on the damp exterior wall, his rough palm pressing against the peeling white paint, and gave me a rare, genuinely proud smile. He told me that strong roots could survive any storm, as long as you cared enough to protect them. That memory became my absolute anchor. It was the definitive proof that we were an unbreakable team, a unified front against the unpredictable world. Everything shattered into a million pieces when I was 16 years old. My mother was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer, and within 8 agonizing months, she was gone. The heavy silence she left behind was absolutely deafening. It echoed in the empty kitchen cabinets, on the still porch swing, and in the sudden, crushing absence of Sunday evening jazz. Her sheet music remained stacked neatly on the piano in the living room for years, gathering a fine layer of dust that neither my father nor I had the heart to wipe away. It felt as though wiping the dust would be erasing the final physical evidence that she had sat there. Even her old dirt-stained gardening gloves remained draped over the railing of the back deck, slowly fading under the harsh summer sun. Losing her did not cause my father to collapse in a sudden, dramatic explosion of grief. Instead, he simply solidified into stone. He became a man who survived entirely on rigid, unbreakable routines rather than unpredictable emotions. He locked his immense, suffocating sorrow away in a quiet corner of his mind and threw himself entirely into maintaining the exact life she had left behind. The two of us clung to that old wooden house as if it were the final, breathing piece of Eleanor left on earth. We formed an unspoken, sacred pact of preservation. We absolutely refused to sell the property. Despite the soaring real estate values in the historic district, we promised never to tear down the original walls or modernize the classic, aging architecture. We kept the groaning front porch swing exactly where she had hung it. We fiercely maintained the tradition of eating dinner together every single Friday night, sitting at the same scratched oak table where she used to grade her students' music sheets. The house became our shared sanctuary, our quiet fortress against a world that had unfairly taken her away. Whenever the grief felt too heavy, whenever I missed her so much that I could barely breathe, my father would find me sitting on the cold front porch steps. He would sit down heavily beside me, the old wood creaking in protest under his weight, and he would look out at the ancient oak tree in the front yard. "This house is the backbone of our family. Sophia," he would say, his voice thick with a quiet, fierce conviction. "It holds everything your mother was, and everything we are. One day, you will be the one who understands it better than anyone else. It will be yours to protect." It was a simple, rustic promise, but it meant absolutely everything to me. It was his way of assuring me that our history was permanently safe. That simple sentence made me believe, with 100% of my heart, that no matter how much our lives might change in the unseen future, my father would never allow anyone to erase my mother from those walls. I believed he would never allow anyone to erase me from his family. He was a genuinely good father. He was my protector, a man who built things to last, a man who swore to protect the memory of the woman we both loved more than life itself. That is exactly why the betrayal, when it finally arrived, felt like a literal knife twisting slowly in my back. It was not just a sudden, angry shift in his behavior. It was the systematic, cold-blooded dismantling of a man I thought I knew completely. When the time finally came for me to leave Wilmington and head off to the university, the goodbye was quiet, but incredibly heavy. The crisp autumn morning I packed my car to drive away. My father stood in the cracked concrete driveway with his rough hands shoved deep in his pockets. He did not cry, but his eyes were unusually bright and focused. Before I got into the driver's seat to leave, I reached into my heavy winter coat pocket, my trembling fingers wrapped tightly around a cold, solid piece of heavy brass. It was the old, original key to the front door of the house. I had specifically asked him for a direct copy the day before, adamantly refusing the bright, shiny new replacement keys from the local hardware store. I wanted the heavy, tarnished key that my mother used to turn in the lock every single afternoon. I kept that old heavy key in my coat pocket every single day I was away at college. It was a small, seemingly insignificant object to anyone else, but it grounded me entirely. It was a physical, undeniable piece of the solemn promise my father had made to me on the front porch. I had absolutely no idea that years later, that exact same brass key would violently transform from a sentimental keepsake into a massive legal and emotional symbol of everything that had been stolen from me. What happened next did not come with a loud crash. It came with a quiet, deadly whisper. It happened exactly 3 years after we buried my mother. The deep, heavy fog of grief that had covered our home was just beginning to lift when my father met Celeste Mercer. They crossed paths at a silent auction hosted by the local historical society, a place my father went purely out of habit rather than a desire to socialize. Celeste was a former luxury real estate broker who specialized in high-end coastal properties. She possessed a voice like spun silk, incredibly soft and soothing, but she evaluated the world with the sharp, calculating gaze of a woman who viewed everything in terms of market value, equity, and immediate liquidity. She did not enter our lives alone. Celeste brought her daughter, Marin, who was a few years younger than me but possessed the social cunning of someone twice her age. Marin was captivatingly charming and ruthlessly tactful. She was exceptionally skilled at reading the emotional temperature of any room she walked into. More importantly, she was an expert at reading the vulnerabilities of wealthy, older men. She knew exactly how long to hold sympathetic eye contact, exactly when to ask my father for mundane advice to make him feel important, and, most lethally, exactly when to drop the word dad into a casual conversation to watch his rigid, guarded posture melt into absolute devotion. In the very beginning, I genuinely tried to give them a fair chance. I was an adult, busy building my career at the architecture firm, and I desperately wanted my father to find companionship. For the first few months, Celeste played the role of the respectful newcomer flawlessly. She roasted organic chickens with rosemary on Sunday evenings, filling the house with a scent that was pleasant but distinctly different from my mother's baking. She bought fresh, expensive white hydrangeas and arranged them perfectly in the entryway. She would even pause occasionally by the old piano, delicately running her manicured fingers over the polished wood, and murmur about how incredibly talented Eleanor must have been. She always used a tone of measured, appropriate mourning. It felt safe. It felt like a gentle, harmless merging of two separate lives. But then the tiny, subtle changes began to appear, and once that insidious process started, there was absolutely no turning back. It was a masterclass in soft, psychological invasion. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I walked into the house to find my mother's large, silver-framed portrait missing from the absolute center of the living room mantel. Celeste had quietly relocated it to the narrow console table in the hallway. When I questioned her about it, she offered a perfectly white, sympathetic smile that made me feel entirely unreasonable for asking. "Oh, sweetheart," Celeste said softly, placing a warm, heavy hand on my forearm. The direct morning sunlight in the living room was beginning to fade the edges of the photograph. I just wanted to protect it from the ultraviolet rays. 2 months later, that exact same photograph was moved again. This time banished to the dark, cramped corner of my father's upstairs study. Soon after, my mother's stained, handwritten recipe cards completely vanished from the kitchen counter. They were replaced by a sleek, voice-activated electronic tablet mounted directly into the subway tile backsplash. Then, the absolute worst blow fell. I drove over for our usual Friday dinner to find the heavy, groaning wooden front porch swing completely gone. The heavy iron hooks in the ceiling were empty. I rushed inside the house, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Celeste was standing in the foyer, calmly directing 2 delivery men who were carrying a sterile, white wicker love seat toward the front door. "Where is the swing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with sudden, hot anger. "Sophia, honey, please lower your voice," Celeste whispered, looking nervously toward the open door as if I were causing a massive neighborhood scandal. The suspension ropes were completely frayed. The wood on the seat was rotting from the inside out. It was a massive safety hazard, a liability waiting to happen. Your father totally agreed it had to go. She did not stop with the exterior. Over the next 6 months, the rich, historic mahogany sideboards and the deep leather armchairs that held the distinct shape and smell of my childhood were systematically hauled away by junk removal services. In their place came light-colored, soulless modern furniture. She brought in beige linen sectionals, sharp glass coffee tables, and abstract, neutral-toned artwork that meant absolutely nothing to anyone. "I am just letting the house breathe," Celeste would announce cheerfully, pouring herself a tall glass of crisp white wine while surveying the bleached living room. But the house was not breathing. It was suffocating under a blanket of sterile perfection. I could feel my mother's spirit being methodically scrubbed out of every single wall, stripped from every original floorboard, and erased from every quiet corner of the life she had painstakingly built. While Celeste meticulously erased the physical space, Marin eagerly usurped the emotional space. It started with our Friday dinners. I arrived 10 minutes late one evening due to terrible traffic, only to find Marin sitting in my chair at the dining table. It was the exact chair I had sat in since I was 7 years old. "Oh, sorry," Marin said breezily, taking a sip of water and not moving a single inch to get up. "The overhead lighting is just so much better on this side of the table for my skin." Then she started accompanying my father to his prestigious corporate charity galas, the exact formal events I used to attend with him when I was younger. I would log onto social media during my lunch breaks and see perfectly filtered, high-resolution photographs of the three of them smiling brightly at a country club. Celeste always posted these images with captions reading "Family First" or "Blessed Beyond Measure." They looked like a complete, flawless, wealthy unit. I looked like a forgotten ghost hovering on the absolute outer edges of their bright new reality. Whenever I tried to push back, whenever I tried to express the deep, raw pain pooling inside my chest, Celeste deployed a defensive strategy that was practically impossible to argue against without sounding crazy. She weaponized logic and practicality against my emotional grief. She reframed every single invasion as a necessary, practical update. She twisted every boundary crossed into an act of maternal care. Worst of all, she made my very real, bleeding wounds look like the irrational, hysterical sensitivity of a spoiled child who simply refused to grow up. "Sophia, you are holding on to things that are simply material items," Celeste told me one evening in the remodeled kitchen, her tone laced with a thick, patronizing pity. "Your father is finally looking forward instead of backward. I know you are highly sensitive, but you cannot force him to live inside a depressing museum just because you are not personally ready to heal." I turned to my father, desperately hoping he would step in and see the slow, deliberate takeover happening right under his nose. But my father was profoundly exhausted. He had carried the heavy, crushing weight of mourning for over a decade. Celeste had swept into his life and eagerly taken over the tedious, exhausting mechanics of daily living. She paid the utility bills on time, managed his complicated social calendar, scheduled his medical appointments, and kept the newly beige house running with absolute military precision. He was drowning in gratitude for the ease she provided. He willingly traded the deep, complicated truth of my pain for the shallow, immediate comfort of her artificial peace. "She is just trying to make things nice for us. Sophia," he muttered one night in the hallway, rubbing his tired eyes and steadfastly refusing to meet my pleading gaze. "She does so much around here. Please do not make a war out of everything. Just let it be. That is the most dangerous kind of theft in the world." The Whitaker family was not robbed by a violent home invasion in the middle of the night. Our front door was not violently kicked off its hinges. We were systematically rewritten by hundreds of tiny, polite changes that no one bothered to stop when they first started. Celeste and Marin did not bring a sledgehammer to the walls of our family. They simply replaced the bricks, one by one, with a warm smile, until I woke up completely trapped on the outside of my own life. I did not realize it then, but the worst betrayal was still waiting in the shadows. The absolute breaking point did not happen during a loud screaming match or a dramatic physical confrontation. It happened quietly, wrapped entirely in the sterile, terrifying atmosphere of a cardiac intensive care unit. It was the middle of July. I was up in Richmond, Virginia, spending 3 grueling days surveying the crumbling brick foundation of an abandoned bank building for a major preservation project. My phone vibrated frantically against my clipboard just past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a frantic nurse from the hospital down in Wilmington. My father had suffered a massive heart attack, which was immediately followed by a mild but severely debilitating stroke. Panic is a cold, suffocating blanket that instantly wraps around your lungs. I abandoned my equipment on the site and raced out to my rental car, only to discover that a violent, unseasonal summer storm system had completely shut down the entire eastern seaboard. Every single commercial flight out of the regional airport was grounded indefinitely. The highways were flooded with torrential rain, turning a straightforward drive into a treacherous nightmare. I sat trapped in a cheap highway motel room for 48 agonizing hours, dialing Celeste's number over and over again while the storm raged outside. Every single call went straight to a generic, automated voicemail. I texted her 30 different times. I begged for any shred of medical information. I received absolute, echoing silence in return. By the time the roads finally cleared and I drove through the muddy coastal remnants of the storm back to North Carolina, my father was already out of emergency surgery and resting in the cardiac step-down unit. I sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, my clothes wrinkled and my hands shaking violently, but I never made it anywhere near his bedside. Celeste was waiting like a perfectly positioned, impenetrable sentinel right outside the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit. She did not look distressed, tired, or worried. She looked completely immaculate and entirely in control of the territory. "You cannot go in there, Sophia," she said, raising a flat, unyielding hand to physically block my path before I could even take another step forward. The surgical team was incredibly specific this morning. His blood pressure is fluctuating at a dangerously high level. He absolutely cannot be agitated, and frankly, your sudden presence is just too much of an emotional trigger for his heart right now. I argued until my throat burned. I pleaded with her, promising I just needed to stand at the edge of his bed and hold his hand for 2 minutes so he knew I had come. She stared back at me with eyes as cold and flat as dead river stones. She absolutely refused to move an inch, defeated, utterly exhausted, and terrified of causing him any physical harm. I handed over the damp bouquet of white lilies I had frantically purchased from the downstairs gift shop. I also gave her a deeply personal, handwritten letter I had composed during the endless hours stranded at the motel. I walked slowly out to the damp concrete parking garage and left him a desperate, tearful voicemail, begging him to stay strong and get better. I would discover much later how masterfully my stepmother utilized my forced physical absence. While my father lay trapped inside that mechanical hospital bed, physically weak and emotionally terrified by his own sudden mortality, Celeste initiated the most lethal phase of her psychological takeover. She brought him a brightly printed copy of an electronic email. The sender address was expertly spoofed to look exactly like my personal work account. The text of the forged message was brutal, incredibly cold, and efficiently merciless. It explicitly stated that I was totally exhausted by the endless burden of managing his fragile emotional state over the years. It cruelly demanded that he should simply sell the old house, liquidate the past, and finally stop dragging me down into his perpetual, suffocating grief. My father read that piece of printer paper through his reading glasses, his hands shaking violently from the lingering physical trauma of the stroke. The forgery was brilliantly vicious because it successfully weaponized his deepest, darkest internal fear. He had always secretly terrified himself with the thought that his real daughter had grown completely sick of living in the shadow of a mother who was no longer there. He swallowed the devastating lie whole because the sharp pain of it felt entirely familiar to his insecure mind. He felt deeply humiliated, painfully discarded, and profoundly alone in that hospital room. Celeste expertly struck while the emotional wound was bleeding out on the white sheets. Under the completely plausible guise of managing his overwhelming medical bureaucracy, she placed a massive stack of thick legal documents on his rolling plastic tray table. She casually referred to them as standard recovery authorizations and insurance mandates. Tucked neatly right in the middle of those mundane papers was a comprehensive, legally binding limited power of attorney. With one weak, shaky signature, my father legally handed her the absolute right to manage his property files, reroute his primary mailing addresses, and access every single electronic portal tied directly to our family home. The digital barricade was erected instantly. Every single piece of physical mail addressed to me at the house was permanently forwarded to a different, unknown location. My actual emails were automatically filtered into hidden trash folders on his laptop. My personal cell phone number was completely wiped from his emergency medical contact files and permanently replaced with Marin's number. My father was locked tight inside an isolated echo chamber where Celeste was the sole, trusted narrator of reality. He only heard the terrible, twisted story she decided to tell. I managed to get exactly one short phone call through to him about 3 weeks after he was finally discharged to home care. I was pacing the wooden floor of my apartment, my heart hammering against my ribs with desperate relief, just to hear the raspy, familiar sound of his breathing. But the voice that answered the phone was not the loving father I knew. It was a cold, distant, and incredibly hostile stranger. He did not ask how my architectural project in Richmond went. He did not thank me for the heartfelt voicemail or the letter that he never actually received. He simply launched into a flat, devastating accusation that stopped my breath entirely. "I know you are only calling to check on your mother's house, Sophia," he said, his words slicing through the telephone line like a jagged razor blade. "That is the absolute only thing you actually care about anymore. Just let me heal in peace and leave me alone." The line went completely dead. A sharp click, followed by the terrible sound of empty static. I stood completely frozen in the center of my living room, the phone pressed tightly against my ear until my knuckles turned white. I was entirely paralyzed by the sheer injustice of his cruel words. I could not understand why the man who had patiently taught me how to build strong, lasting foundations was suddenly using the very foundation of my deepest grief to actively tear me down. I had been forcefully rejected at the hospital doors. I had been spoken to like a greedy, invading stranger by my own flesh and blood. I finally stopped fighting. I retreated into the quiet safety of my own life, pulling back not because I had stopped loving him, but because my own basic self-respect demanded that I stop throwing my battered body against a heavy wooden door that he continuously chose to slam shut in my face. While I was silently grieving the loss of a father who was still alive, Marin was actively plotting her own financial salvation in the background. She had recently launched a luxury wellness brand named Ember House. It was a massive, incredibly expensive vanity project that sold overpriced crystal face rollers and imported silk meditation mats. It looked absolutely beautiful on social media, but it was violently bleeding cash behind closed doors. She was drowning rapidly in unpaid vendor invoices, massive commercial lease debts, and terrifying federal tax liabilities. For the very first time since she moved in, Marin stopped looking at Eleanor's house as an annoying, dusty relic of my dead mother. She began to look hungrily at the massive, completely unencumbered equity sitting silently inside those old wooden walls. She did not see a home full of memories. She saw a lucrative rescue boat, and she was more than willing to hold my father underwater if it meant she could climb aboard and save herself. The financial trap they set was almost perfect, but they completely underestimated the man I married. I threw every single ounce of my remaining energy into the heavy, dusty work at Thorn and Vale Urban Studio. If my own family foundation had been meticulously dismantled and stolen from me, I was going to spend my days fiercely protecting the foundations of others. I built a formidable reputation across the East Coast in the highly specialized field of historical commercial preservation. I spent my weeks climbing rusted scaffolding, analyzing century-old masonry, and fighting ruthless urban developers in tense city council meetings. It was during a grueling legal battle over an abandoned theater district that I met Daniel Cross. Daniel was an attorney, but not the loud, performative type who paced aggressively around courtrooms playing to a jury. He specialized entirely in electronic discovery and digital forensics. He spent his life swimming through the invisible digital oceans of corporate fraud, metadata stripping, and hidden financial ledgers. Our marriage was not built on explosive, cinematic fairy tale romance. It was built on absolute, unshakable, solid ground. Daniel is a profoundly quiet man, but his silence is highly observant. He possesses a terrifyingly sharp mind that instinctively hunts for the hidden flaws in any narrative that sounds just a little too perfect. He knows that human beings lie constantly, but digital footprints never do. Life had settled into a steady, predictable rhythm until a random Tuesday afternoon shattered it completely. I was standing at our kitchen island, sorting through a small stack of mail that had been automatically forwarded from my old apartment address. Hidden between a glossy catalog and a water bill was a stark, unmarked white envelope. Inside was a formal notice of severe delinquency and impending default on a massive home equity line of credit. I stared at the heavy black letters printed on the page, my vision blurring at the edges. The loan was directly attached to the historic Whitaker family home. The only reason I had even received the notice was due to a deeply buried, original trust structure my mother had quietly established decades ago, which legally mandated that any party of interest be notified of severe structural financial changes. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I had never seen this bank logo before. I had never signed a single piece of paper authorizing a loan against that property. I had absolutely no idea the house had ever been violently leveraged into debt. Daniel, I whispered, my voice cracking entirely. Look at this. Daniel walked into the kitchen, took the crumpled piece of paper from my trembling hands, and read it with his typical, chillingly calm focus. He did not offer empty, comforting platitudes. He did not tell me everything was going to be fine. He simply turned around, walked straight to his home office, and opened his laptop. What followed was a masterclass in modern legal warfare. Over the next 48 hours, our dining room table transformed into a war room of digital forensic reconstruction. Daniel utilized his high-level legal access to plunge deep into the county deed records, property history logs, and encrypted loan origination packages. He pulled the digital certificates from the online notarization platform used to finalize the loan, and cross-referenced them with the Postal Service digital footprints for mail forwarding orders. They were incredibly arrogant, Daniel said quietly late one night, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his dark eyes. They assumed no one would ever actually look at the metadata. He turned the screen toward me. He had pulled the original digitally scanned applications for the home equity line of credit, along with a newly filed, highly suspicious beneficiary adjustment document that attempted to rewrite my mother's estate structure. He pointed to the signature line. "Look at the letters," he instructed. I leaned in closely. It was supposed to be my father's signature, but the sharp, confident loops of his handwriting were entirely wrong. The downward stroke on the letter W was far too short, hesitant, and cramped. It was the desperate forgery of someone trying to mimic a signature using a digital stylus on a glass screen. "Now look at this," Daniel continued, pulling up a highly technical, multi-page data log. This loan was finalized using an emergency remote online notarization service. The notary logged the session entirely through a digital portal. I traced the internet protocol address tied to the specific computer that initiated the session. He tapped the screen. The physical location tied to the digital address resolved perfectly to Marin's luxury downtown apartment complex. "And the timestamp?" I asked, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. "The exact same week, your father was heavily medicated, bedridden, and physically trapped in the cardiac intensive care unit," Daniel confirmed, his voice devoid of any emotion, treating the devastating betrayal as a pure, undeniable fact. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Celeste had not just isolated my father to rewrite our emotional history. She had isolated him to execute a massive, coordinated financial extraction. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Daniel relentlessly followed the heavy flow of the stolen money. He subpoenaed the wire transfer histories tied to the disbursement accounts. Not a single dollar from that massive loan had gone toward my father's expensive post-surgical medical bills. Not a single cent had gone toward repairing the historic wooden roof or updating the aging plumbing of the old house. The money had been immediately, aggressively funneled straight into Marin's failing wellness brand. Ember House. Daniel showed me the routing numbers. The borrowed equity from my mother's sacred home had been desperately flushed away. To cover Marin's ballooning commercial lease payments, her massive employee payroll deficits, and a crushing, highly aggressive federal tax lien she had secretly accumulated, Marin had literally bled my family's foundation dry to prop up her own hollow, failing facade. "There is a hard deadline on this, Sophia," Daniel said, closing the laptop with a soft, final click that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "This notice is not just a warning. They are drastically behind on the monthly payments because Marin's company is still actively drowning." He handed me a final, printed sheet of paper. It was a preliminary schedule for a forced residential foreclosure auction. The date was set for exactly 11 days after my father's upcoming, highly publicized corporate retirement party. "It gets worse," Daniel warned, holding my gaze entirely steady. "I reviewed your father's corporate pension and executive contract. Because of the specific banking institution they used, there is a cross-collateralization clause hidden deep in the fine print. The very minute he officially retires, the bank has the absolute legal right to automatically sweep his entire corporate retirement bonus to cover the defaulted loan. If we do not stop this right now, Your father is going to step into his retirement with no house, no bonus, and absolutely nothing left to his name. I felt physically sick. The absolute cruelty of the plan was staggering. Celeste and Marin were going to let him smile, accept his corporate accolades, and then watch him fall completely off a financial cliff, likely blaming the entire catastrophic loss on a sudden, mysterious banking error. "We have to warn him," I said, standing up frantically. "I have to drive to the house right now and break the door down if I have to." "No," Daniel said firmly, catching my hand and stopping me in my tracks. "Celeste completely controls the house. She controls his mobile phone. She controls his incoming mail. If you go there, she will call the police, have you arrested for trespassing, and tell your father you have finally lost your mind. She has spent years building a psychological quarantine zone around him. You cannot fight her inside the zone she built." He looked at the printed calendar on the table. "If you truly want your father to see the undeniable truth, we have to drag him entirely out of the dark," Daniel stated, his tone shifting into the cold, calculated cadence of a trial lawyer preparing for war. "We have to hit them in the one single place where Celeste cannot easily cut the microphone, filter the emails, or close the doors. The retirement party." He was absolutely right. The grand ballroom at the Riverfront Hotel would be packed with hundreds of his lifelong corporate colleagues, board members, and industry peers. It was a massive, highly public forum. It was the only environment where Celeste would be forced to maintain her flawless, polite societal mask, making it incredibly difficult for her to control the entire narrative when the explosive truth was finally dropped onto the table. We were going to that party. We were going to let them play their polite, fake family charade right up until the final moment. And then, Daniel was going to open his leather folder, and we were going to force every single lie into the blinding light of day. The grand ballroom of the Riverfront Hotel was not simply a venue. It was a carefully constructed, highly expensive stage set for the debut of a brand new family. Every single detail of my father's retirement gala had been aggressively curated by Celeste to project absolute, unassailable perfection. The ambient lighting was a soft, forgiving gold that made the crystal champagne flutes sparkle and cast warm halos around the wealthy guests. The tables were draped in heavy white linen and adorned with towering floral centerpieces that smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and fresh eucalyptus. It was a flawless corporate advertisement for Warren Whitaker's highly successful life, masking the deep, rotting decay hiding just beneath the polished surface. Celeste moved through the wealthy crowd of executives, board members, and local politicians like a seasoned theater director on opening night. She wore a sleek silver gown, her smile bright and completely hollow. She constantly repositioned herself, gracefully directing conversations and expertly managing the social flow of the room. She had strategically placed Daniel and me at that terrible back table near the kitchen for a very specific, cruel reason. She wanted me to be physically present, visible enough to anyone who casually glanced toward the back, so she could maintain the public illusion of being a gracious, inclusive stepmother. However, she ensured I was seated far enough away that no one would actually recognize me or strike up a meaningful conversation. I was merely a silent prop in her grand play, meant to be briefly seen but entirely ignored. The first true, sickening shock of the evening happened long before the slideshow even began. I was making my way back from the restroom, navigating carefully through the maze of crowded tables, when I suddenly found myself standing only a few feet away from Marin. She was laughing loudly, holding a tall glass of sparkling water, and tilting her head back to accept a compliment from one of my father's wealthy investors. The warm chandelier light caught the side of her face, and my breath violently hitched in my throat. Hanging from Marin's earlobes were two distinct, teardrop-shaped sapphire earrings surrounded by a brilliant halo of crushed diamonds. They were Eleanor's earrings. They were the exact same jewels my father had proudly gifted my mother on their 15th wedding anniversary. I vividly remembered my father placing them into the heavy steel family safe the week after her funeral, specifically promising me they would be securely locked away until my own wedding day. Seeing them dangling casually from Marin's ears, worn as if they were just cheap costume jewelry purchased at a local mall. Felt like a harsh physical slap across the face. My stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. The absolute audacity of the public theft was staggering. Yet I could not scream. I was forced to swallow the bitter venom rising in my throat and keep walking. Before I could even fully process the stolen jewelry, a heavy hand clapped warmly onto my shoulder. I turned around to see Arthur Pendleton, the retired head of the structural engineering department who had worked alongside my father for over 2 decades. He had a kind, deeply wrinkled face and a warm, genuine smile. "Sophia Whitaker, my goodness, look at you," Arthur beamed, pulling me into a brief, awkward hug. "Where on earth have you been hiding? We have not seen you at a company function in nearly 4 years." I forced a polite, trembling smile, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I have been incredibly busy with work, Arthur. Just managing my architectural projects." "Well, I am certainly not surprised," Arthur chuckled, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "Your father used to talk our ears off about your historical preservation firm. Every single time you landed a major city contract or saved a crumbling theater downtown, Warren would march right into the break room and aggressively show us the newspaper clippings. He was so incredibly proud of the brilliant architect you became." His innocent words hit me like a runaway freight train. My father used to brag about me. He used to carry physical newspaper clippings of my achievements into his corporate office. That undeniable fact completely shattered the false narrative Celeste had been feeding me for the past 3 years. It definitively proved that my father had not simply forgotten about me due to a stroke or overwhelming grief. His absolute silence tonight, his refusal to invite me to the head table, the total glaring absence of my name from the official seating program, it was all an active, deliberate choice. My erasure from this room was not an accident of old age. It was a highly calculated execution orchestrated by the woman smiling brightly by the stage. When the room lights finally dimmed and the tribute slideshow finished erasing my mother and me from history, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. His voice boomed cheerfully across the silent, attentive room. "And now, to lead us in a special toast, I would like to invite the daughter who has never left Warren's side. Please welcome Marin to the stage." I looked sharply at Celeste. She was standing near the edge of the elevated platform, her manicured hands clasped delicately in front of her. The look of absolute smug satisfaction radiating from her face was absolutely chilling. She looked exactly like a criminal who had just successfully pulled off a massive, multi-million-dollar heist and was now casually walking out the front doors of the bank. This public toast was meant to be the final, irreversible legalization of a lie she had been carefully building for years. That was the exact moment I stepped out of the shadows and walked straight toward the head table. As I approached, the low murmurs of the crowd began to swell into a confused buzzing sound, but I tuned them out entirely. I did not want to cause a screaming match. I did not want to flip a table or throw a glass of expensive champagne at anyone. I just desperately wanted my father to look me directly in the eyes, in front of all his respected peers, and acknowledge the actual truth. I wanted him to see the daughter he used to proudly brag about to Arthur Pendleton, but instead of a conversation, I received his violent, dismissive wrath. When I reached for the empty wooden chair beside him, his eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying fury. He shoved me hard. As I hit the polished wooden floor, a sickening, sharp sound ripped through the silent ballroom. The delicate vintage silk at the hem of my mother's midnight blue dress caught under the heel of my shoe and tore completely open. The sound of the tearing fabric was quiet to the room, but to me, it was absolutely deafening. It sounded exactly like the final, violent snapping of a bridge that could never, ever be rebuilt. "That seat is for my real daughter," he had declared loudly, completely cementing his own tragic delusion. Lying there on the floor, feeling the cool draft of the room against my exposed skin, I realized something profoundly heartbreaking. The man standing above me was no longer the strong father who had taught me how to fix wooden hinges or weather a coastal hurricane. He was a hollowed-out shell, entirely possessed and controlled by the parasites who were actively feeding off his grief. My heavy brass house key lay gleaming on the dark wood, a silent, damning witness to the destruction. Daniel materialized silently by my side. His strong hands gripped my arms, pulling me up with a gentle but incredibly grounding force. He did not brush the dust off my torn dress. He did not look at me with useless pity. He looked down at the key, then slowly turned his icy, unblinking gaze toward the head table. The air in the room had grown dangerously thin. The cheerful clinking of glasses had completely ceased. Every single pair of eyes in that massive ballroom was locked onto our solitary standoff. Daniel calmly opened his dark leather folder. He pulled out the first printed document, the fraudulent county property record, and held it with absolute steadiness. His voice cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room like a perfectly sharpened surgical scalpel. It was not loud, but the lethal precision of his tone commanded total, terrifying authority. "Sir," Daniel asked my father, his dark eyes narrowing slightly, "did you ever sign any electronic documents regarding Eleanor's house?" In that single, breathtaking second, the entire fundamental nature of the evening violently flipped. The opulent retirement gala instantly evaporated into thin air. The gold lighting, the towering flowers, and the corporate banners entirely ceased to matter. The grand ballroom instantly transformed from a joyful celebration of a successful career into a brutal, unforgiving public tribunal. The perfectly constructed walls of Celeste's private quarantine zone had just been entirely blown apart, and there was absolutely no one in that room who could possibly look away from the wreckage. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room completely paralyzed by shock, a whisper can sound exactly like a gunshot. He stepped up to the edge of the elevated head table. His dark eyes locked entirely on my father, and calmly began to empty the thin leather folder. He placed the first printed document face up on the pristine white linen tablecloth. It was the formal county property record. He placed the second document right next to it. It was the heavily stamped notice of severe delinquency. The third document was the electronic notarization log, and the fourth was a highly detailed spreadsheet of the disbursement cash flow. He laid them down one by one, methodically, deliberately. The soft, heavy thud of the paper hitting the table echoed loudly in the breathless ballroom. Each piece of paper landed like a vicious physical strike against the flawless facade Celeste had spent years building. Celeste reacted instantly, her survival instincts kicking in with terrifying speed. She lunged forward, her silver gown flashing under the golden chandeliers, and desperately tried to sweep the papers off the table. "Security! We need security in here immediately," Celeste commanded, her voice rising into a sharp, hysterical pitch. She turned frantically toward the crowd of frozen executives. "I am so incredibly sorry. Everyone. Sophia and her husband are just deeply bitter, unstable people. They crashed this private event specifically to ruin Warren's special night out of pure, childish jealousy. Please, ignore this entirely." Daniel did not even blink. He did not engage with her frantic emotional outbursts. He reached out and planted his hand firmly over the documents, preventing her from moving them. He looked right past her, fixing his cold, unwavering gaze directly onto my father's pale face. "Sir," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a chilling, conversational tone, "I have a very simple question for you. When do you ever sign anything on a screen?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with undeniable reality. Warren stared blankly at Daniel, his jaw trembling slightly. He did not answer, but the profound realization slowly washing over his face was all the confirmation anyone needed. A murmur rippled rapidly through the front tables. Everyone in that room, especially the men and women who had worked closely with my father for 35 years, knew his absolute, stubborn hatred for modern technology. Arthur Pendleton, seated just a few yards away, actually let out a sharp gasp. My father was legendary at the corporate office for entirely refusing to use electronic signature software. He always forced his junior architects and structural engineers to print out massive, heavy stacks of blueprints and physical contracts so he could review them with a red pen and sign them with wet ink. He did not trust digital portals. He did not even know how to properly log into the secure company intranet without asking his secretary for help. "You do not sign things on screens," Daniel continued smoothly, pointing a steady finger at the loan origination package. Yet, a massive home equity line of credit was legally finalized against Eleanor's house using an emergency remote online portal. Furthermore, a secondary legal document adjusting the future beneficiary rights of the property was filed simultaneously. Both of these legally binding documents were executed using a digital stylus. Daniel tapped the printed signature on the top page. "The downward stroke on your letter W is entirely wrong, sir. It is short, hesitant, and completely unnatural. It is the exact digital forgery of someone sitting in an apartment miles away, tracing your name while you were heavily sedated in a hospital bed." Celeste's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words completely failed her. Daniel did not stop. He was a surgeon actively dismantling a disease, and he was not going to leave a single infected cell behind. He picked up the cash flow spreadsheet and held it up so the front row of corporate investors could clearly see the highlighted yellow lines. "The most tragic part of this fraud is not the forged signature," Daniel stated, his voice ringing with absolute icy authority. "It is where the stolen equity actually went. Not a single penny of this massive loan went to your medical recovery. Sir, it did not go into your retirement savings. The vast majority of the funds were aggressively wired directly into commercial business accounts to save a failing wellness brand named Ember House." The entire ballroom collectively inhaled. Marin, who had been standing frozen near the microphone, physically flinched as if she had just been struck by lightning. "The money from your wife's house was secretly drained to pay off 3 months of overdue commercial rent, a massive backlog of employee payroll, and a highly aggressive federal tax lien that your stepdaughter was desperately trying to hide from the government," Daniel revealed, dropping the spreadsheet back onto the table. Marin panicked. The pristine, charming mask she had worn all evening violently shattered under the sheer pressure of the public exposure. Her survival instinct completely overrode her logic. "That is a complete lie," Marin screamed into the microphone, the loud, distorted feedback echoing painfully through the large room. "We did not take all of it. There is still exactly $142,000 sitting completely untouched in the reserve account." A dead, horrifying silence instantly swallowed the ballroom. No one moved. No one breathed. Daniel slowly pulled his hand back from the table. A cold, victorious smile touched the absolute corners of his mouth. He looked at Marin with the terrifying satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just watched a suspect willingly lock themselves inside a prison cell. "How would you possibly know the exact, down-to-the-penny balance of a private residential loan reserve account if you had absolutely nothing to do with opening it?" Daniel asked quietly. Marin clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with sudden, suffocating terror. She looked wildly at her mother, but Celeste was completely paralyzed, staring at Marin with a look of pure, unadulterated rage. The careless slip of the tongue was the ultimate, undeniable confession. Marin knew the exact financial figures because she was the one actively spending the stolen money. Daniel turned his attention back to my father. Warren looked like a man who had just been violently thrown from a moving vehicle. He was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were entirely white, his breathing shallow and rapid. "The money is mostly gone, sir, and the monthly payments have completely stopped." Daniel delivered the final, crushing legal blow. "A forced foreclosure auction has already been officially scheduled with the county. It is set to take place exactly 11 days from tonight. If we had not walked into this room, you would have woken up in the first 2 weeks of your retirement to find a bank padlock on your front door. You would have lost the house, and due to your corporate banking clauses, they would have automatically swept your entire executive retirement bonus to cover the remaining deficit." The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The wealthy colleagues, the board members, And the old friends were no longer looking at my husband and me as jealous, bitter interlopers. They were staring at Celeste and Marin with absolute, undisguised disgust. The wealthy elite of Wilmington tolerate many personal flaws, but they absolutely do not tolerate blatant financial theft. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward slightly, his kind face hardened into a mask of pure anger, positioning himself physically closer to my father as if to shield him from his own wife. The humiliating family drama had officially transformed into a massive, dark criminal conspiracy, and Celeste had completely lost control of the narrative. Celeste finally found her voice. She stood up tall, her eyes flashing with a desperate, cornered venom. "This is completely fabricated evidence," she hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Daniel. "You are a manipulative, lying lawyer. You manufactured these documents to destroy my family because your wife has always been obsessed with hoarding her dead mother's things. Warren, do not listen to a single word this man is saying. Sophia has been trying to tear us apart since the day we met. She was preparing to launch a full, aggressive counterattack, ready to drag my emotional instability back into the spotlight to discredit the financial truth." Daniel did not argue with her. He simply reached inside his tailored suit jacket for a second time. He pulled out another, slightly thicker manila envelope. The sight of it made Celeste instantly freeze in her tracks. Her aggressive posture collapsed entirely. "The stolen loan is only half of the story," Daniel said, his voice echoing loudly across the tense, expectant crowd. He held the sealed envelope up directly under the bright chandelier light. He looked right into my father's devastated eyes. "The financial theft explains how they took your money. But the contents of this envelope, sir, will finally explain exactly why you were so easily convinced that your own flesh and blood completely abandoned you when you needed her the most." Daniel unsealed the thick manila envelope, the tearing of the heavy paper echoing sharply in the completely silent ballroom. He pulled out a dense stack of technical metadata reports, sliding them across the white linen tablecloth right next to the damning financial ledgers. "This is a digital forensic analysis of the email that finally broke your relationship with your daughter," Daniel stated, his dark eyes fixed intensely on my father. "The message that claimed Sophia was completely exhausted by your grief. The message that convinced you she wanted nothing more to do with you." My father swallowed hard, his face a pale, horrified mask. "That email was never sent from Sophia's firm," Daniel continued, his voice echoing with brutal clarity. "The digital footprint proves it was drafted during the exact same week you were lying incapacitated in the cardiac intensive care unit. It was typed on a laptop logged directly into Celeste's personal user profile. It was sent through a spoofed server, printed on the laser printer in your own home office, and then immediately, permanently deleted from the hard drive." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the surrounding tables. Daniel laid out another set of printed logs. "While she was playing the role of your devoted caretaker, she initiated a hostile, systematic takeover of your entire existence," Daniel explained. "I have the United States Postal Service confirmation receipts for the change of address forms. I have the digital access logs showing when your personal emergency contact files were completely rewritten. She used the medical power of attorney you signed to legally hijack your incoming mail, your email servers, and your phone records." Before Celeste could even attempt to formulate another desperate lie, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards near the center of the room. Vivian Hale, my father's younger sister, stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her face was set in a tight, furious glare directed entirely at her brother. "Warren, I tried to warn you," Aunt Vivian called out, her voice vibrating with years of repressed frustration. "I tried to tell you something was horribly wrong. Last Thanksgiving, I went into your garage to find the holiday decorations. I found a large plastic storage bin shoved behind the winter tires. It was filled to the brim with unopened, handwritten letters. I recognized Sophia's handwriting on every single envelope. When I tried to bring it up to you, Celeste practically pushed me out the front door, and you completely refused to listen to me." The sudden, corroborating testimony from his own blood sister made my father physically stumble backward. knocking his chair over with a loud crash. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward from the crowd, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Vivian is absolutely right," Arthur boomed, pointing an accusing finger at Celeste. "During those 3 months of your severe medical recovery, Warren, I called your house at least 20 different times to check on you. Celeste always answered your mobile phone. She always told us you were far too weak to speak, that the doctors demanded absolute isolation. We never heard your actual voice once. She kept you entirely locked away from the world. The perfectly constructed walls of the isolation zone were crumbling in real time, exposing the ugly, rotting framework beneath. The crushing weight of the public exposure finally became too much for Marin, the glamorous, confident woman who had practically glided to the microphone just 20 minutes earlier, completely shattered. She spun around, her face twisted in absolute panic, and unleashed her terror directly onto her mother. "You told me it was just a temporary bridge loan," Marin screamed, her voice cracking violently. "You promised me we were just going to quietly sell the ugly old house right after his retirement bonus cleared. You said we would move him into a smaller luxury condominium across town, pay off my business debts, and cover the entire thing up before he ever noticed the money was missing." The absolute silence that followed her hysterical confession was deafening. Marin had just publicly admitted to premeditated conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. My father slowly turned his head. For the very first time in 3 agonizing years, he looked at me. The icy, hostile glare he had given me when he shoved me to the floor was entirely gone. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, drowning realization of the catastrophic mistake he had made. He looked at me not as an ungrateful traitor, but as his real, deeply wronged daughter. He took a small, trembling step toward me, his hands reaching out in a silent, desperate plea for forgiveness. But I did not step forward to meet him. I stood my ground next to Daniel. My heart was breaking for the broken man standing in front of me, but the deep, ragged wounds he had inflicted could not be magically healed by a single moment of clarity. Being manipulated by a monster does not completely erase your own choices. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "When she handed you a single piece of paper claiming I hated you, you did not call my office. You did not drive to my apartment to look me in the eye. You chose to believe the absolute worst, easiest lie about me because it perfectly justified your own cowardice. You chose the quiet comfort of her fake reality over the difficult truth of our shared grief." His hands dropped to his sides. He looked utterly destroyed. Seeing that the devoted, loving wife routine was completely dead and buried, Celeste finally dropped the act entirely. The warm, polite mask vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating face of a predator who viewed human beings entirely as disposable financial assets. She straightened her posture, smoothing down the front of her silver gown with chilling calmness. "Oh, please spare us the emotional theatrics. Sophia," Celeste spat, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You were going to inherit that massive, ridiculous piece of rotting wood eventually anyway. You would have legally locked Marin and me out the very second your father passed away. I simply secured my own equity. I took one single step ahead to protect my own family, because you certainly were never going to share." She looked at my father with absolute disgust. "I gave up my life to play nursemaid to a grieving, pathetic old man. I earned every single penny of that house." Daniel stepped smoothly between my father and Celeste, his presence an immovable physical barrier. "You did significantly more than take one single step ahead," Daniel corrected her, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. He reached into the empty folder and produced one final heavily stamped legal document. "While you were busy securing your stolen equity, you also filed a secondary petition to alter the transfer on death designation for the property," Daniel revealed, holding the paper up. "And hiding right behind that is a drafted, unfiled legal petition seeking to declare Warren entirely mentally incompetent to manage his own financial estate. The very minute he tries to fight this foreclosure or cut off your access to his accounts, you plan to activate this petition, freeze his entire life, and claim his previous stroke left him mentally unfit to testify against you. A wave of genuine horror swept through the room. She had not just planned to steal his money, she had built a legal cage to trap him inside his own mind if he ever dared to fight back. She had armed a nuclear bomb beneath his retirement, ensuring that any attempt to save his legacy would result in the complete destruction of his personal autonomy. The grand retirement party ended not with a tearful family reconciliation, but with the terrifying sensation of absolute freefall. The golden chandeliers continued to shine, and the expensive champagne remained in the glasses. But my father had just lost absolutely everything. His fake, perfect family was a criminal illusion. His life savings were tied to a sinking ship. I had finally forced the absolute truth into the blinding light. But standing there in my mother's torn midnight blue dress, I realized the hardest part of the war was still waiting for us. The truth was out, but the house was still burning, and we had exactly 11 days to save it from turning entirely to ash. The fallout from the ballroom did not end when the lights went down. It accelerated into a dead sprint. By the time my father was escorted back to his house by my Aunt Vivian, the master bedroom closet had been entirely cleaned out. Celeste had vanished into the humid coastal night. She did not just take her expensive clothes. The heavy steel family safe hidden in the floor of the study had been cracked open. She took my mother's velvet jewelry box, the original property appraisal folders, and a thick stack of physical property deeds that she could legally use to tie up any dispute in court for years. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, her legal team launched a massive preemptive strike. They electronically filed a vicious countersuit with the county courthouse. The filing boldly claimed that my father was suffering from severe cognitive decline exacerbated by the overwhelming shock of his retirement party. It alleged that Daniel and I had ambushed the event to psychologically manipulate a confused old man into handing over his remaining assets. Worst of all, her lawyer filed an emergency motion to expedite the forced foreclosure sale of the house, attempting to push the auction date forward to ensure we had absolutely no time to untangle the financial web. I was pacing the floor of Daniel's home office, fueled entirely by black coffee and sheer adrenaline, when my cell phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me press answer. It was a voicemail left just 10 minutes prior. "Sophia, please, you have to listen to me." Marin's voice crackled through the speaker, breathless and absolutely frantic. My mother left me. She took the remaining cash and shut off her phone. She used a notary who had their license suspended 2 years ago to stamp those loan documents. I just found out she rented a storage unit out on US 17 under my name. She hid all the original forged papers in there. She is setting me up to take the fall for the entire fraud if the federal investigators come knocking. I will give you the access code. Just please do not let her put me in prison. Daniel did not waste a single second. "I am going to the courthouse right now to get an emergency preservation order from the judge," he said, grabbing his leather briefcase. "You get Vivian and Marin, and you get to that storage facility before Celeste realizes Marin flipped on her." 45 minutes later, the three of us stood in front of a corrugated metal roll-up door on the dusty outskirts of town. Marin's hands shook violently as she punched the 6-digit access code into the keypad. The heavy door rattled upward, revealing a cramped, windowless concrete box. Inside, stacked haphazardly in the dark corner, were 3 heavy plastic bins. We tore into them. The evidence was staggering. We found the actual suspended notary logbook, clearly stolen to cover her tracks. We found high-resolution photographs of my father's driver's license, taken while he was asleep in his hospital bed. But the most chilling discovery was a simple manila envelope. Across the front, Celeste had written a timeline in her precise, looping handwriting. The notes explicitly detailed the exact dates the loan money would clear, followed by a final, heavily underlined sentence reading, "Get him out of the house by the 1st of the month." We had the absolute proof we needed. But evidence in a plastic bin means absolutely nothing if the primary victim refuses to take the stand. When Vivian and I drove the bins back to the old wooden house, we found my father sitting in the dark living room, The curtains were drawn tight against the morning sun. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. The shame had completely paralyzed him. "I cannot do this, Sophia," he whispered, staring blankly at the sterile beige rug Celeste had bought. "If I walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning, I have to sit on a witness stand and tell a judge that I was stupid enough to let a stranger rob me blind. I have to publicly admit that I shoved my own daughter to the floor and chose to believe a printed lie over her love. I cannot survive that humiliation. Just let her take the house. I deserve to lose it." Hearing those words triggered a dark, exhausted anger deep inside my chest. I stared at the man who had promised to protect my mother's legacy. For one agonizing, suspended moment, I truly wanted to walk out the front door and never look back. I asked myself why I was fighting so hard to save a man who had not fought for me at all. When I was crying outside the intensive care unit, he had let her lock the door. When I tried to reach out, he called me a greedy stranger. The easiest thing in the world would be to let the foreclosure happen. Let him lose his corporate bonus, and let him live in the miserable reality he had allowed Celeste to build. The pain of that realization was suffocating. It was a brutal, incredibly heavy truth. I turned my back and reached for the brass front doorknob. "Stop right there," Aunt Vivian commanded, her voice cracking like a whip across the quiet room. She marched over to my father, pulling her smartphone from her purse. "You are not going to sit here and drown in your own self-pity, Warren. And you are certainly not going to let this house die because you are too much of a coward to face your own mistakes." Vivian tapped the glowing screen. When Sophia left that frantic voicemail at the hospital 3 years ago, the one Celeste deleted from your room phone, it also recorded a backup file on the intensive care unit's central switchboard system. The hospital administration sent it to me yesterday morning when I finally demanded a review of your restricted communication logs. You are going to listen to exactly what you ignored. She pressed play and turned the volume all the way up. My own voice filled the dark living room. I sounded so young, so utterly broken. "Dad, it is Sophia," the recording cried out, accompanied by the muffled sound of highway traffic in the background. "Celeste will not let me in to see you. Please, you have to get better. I love you so much. Please do not listen to anyone who tells you I do not care. I am right outside. I am right here. Please." The recorded message clicked off, leaving a heavy, ringing silence. My father broke. The rigid, defensive posture he had maintained for years completely collapsed. He buried his face in his rough hands, and for the first time since my mother died, he wept. It was a loud, ragged, ugly sound. The sound of a man violently waking up from a decade-long nightmare to realize he had been the monster all along. He did not offer me a useless, flowery apology. He knew words were entirely insufficient. Instead, he stood up on shaking legs, walked over to the hallway console table, and picked up a heavy black pen. He pulled the blank legal affidavit Daniel had prepared out of the folder and signed his name at the bottom. This time, the signature was strong, sharp, and undeniably his. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy ring of keys. They were the master keys to the bank safety deposit boxes, the ones Celeste had not been able to find before she fled. He pressed the cold metal firmly into the palm of my hand and closed my fingers over them. "I am done hiding," my father said, his voice raw and thick with emotion. "Tell Daniel I will testify to every single thing. I will tell the judge exactly what I did, and exactly what she did. We are not losing your mother's foundation." The battle lines were officially drawn in wet ink. We were standing right on the terrifying edge of the cliff. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the emergency injunction hearing would commence at the county courthouse. That single hour in front of the judge would definitively decide our fate. It would determine if Celeste Mercer would successfully escape into the shadows with the Whitaker family legacy, or if I would finally drag every single rotting lie out into the blinding light of the law. The heavy brass-handled oak doors of the county courthouse swung open exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the courtroom was completely sterile, smelling faintly of old paper and lemon floor polish. The tension vibrating between the polished wooden benches was so incredibly thick, it felt hard to breathe. At the defense table, Celeste sat perfectly upright. She was dressed meticulously in a tailored, conservative charcoal gray suit, her hair pulled back into a neat, elegant twist. She had completely abandoned the vicious predator I had seen the night before. Today, she was actively projecting the flawless image of a terrified, deeply exhausted wife who had spent years caring for a sick husband, only to be ambushed by his greedy, emotionally unstable daughter. She dabbed the corners of her eyes with a white tissue, looking up at the presiding judge with an expression of profound, manufactured tragedy. Daniel did not pace the floor. He did not raise his voice or attempt to match her emotional theatrics. He stood behind the plaintiff's podium like a solid stone pillar, and he meticulously, ruthlessly tore her false narrative apart layer by layer. First, he submitted the official disciplinary logs from the state registry, proving the notary public she used had been permanently suspended 2 years prior for gross professional misconduct. Then, he presented the highly technical digital tracking reports. He walked the judge through the exact Internet protocol addresses, showing unequivocally that the remote loan session originated directly from Marin's luxury apartment complex. He presented the time-stamped login histories and the massive, undeniable trail of wire transfers moving hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my family's equity and straight into the failing corporate accounts of Ember House. Finally, Daniel laid out the digital metadata report from the forged email. He proved, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that the message claiming I was entirely exhausted by my father's grief was drafted, printed, and deleted on a laptop registered directly to Celeste. He proved it happened on the exact Tuesday my father was lying helpless in the cardiac intensive care unit. Celeste's lawyer attempted to object, desperately trying to claim the electronic evidence was circumstantial, but the entire room was about to experience the most massive, unexpected shock of the morning. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Marin walked slowly down the center aisle. She had not arrived with her mother. She had retained her own independent defense counsel early that morning. Marin possessed an incredible survival instinct, and when she realized the massive ship of their criminal conspiracy was rapidly sinking to the bottom of the ocean, she completely severed ties with her captain to avoid drowning. Marin took the witness stand, placed her hand firmly on the leather-bound Bible, and delivered a sworn, absolutely devastating testimony against her own mother. She explicitly confirmed that Celeste was the sole architect of the entire fraud. She testified that her mother actively intercepted my handwritten letters, purposefully changed the mailing addresses, and relentlessly pushed the fraudulent property loan to secretly fund Marin's business under the promise of a quick cover-up. Before stepping down, Marin handed over a small, sealed envelope containing the exact locker number and access code for the private vault where she had hidden my mother's stolen sapphire earrings. Sitting at the defense table, Celeste's perfect, tearful mask violently shattered, she stared at her daughter with a twisted contortion of pure, unadulterated hatred. The elegant, devoted wife was completely dead. Only the trapped thief remained, but the heaviest, most crushing blow of the entire hearing did not come from Daniel's brilliant forensic evidence, and it did not come from Marin's desperate betrayal. It came from the man sitting quietly right beside me. My father stood up. He did not look at his defense attorneys, and he refused to look at the woman he had married. He looked directly at the judge, and then he turned his body entirely toward the gallery, ensuring his voice carried clearly into the official public record. "I was a profoundly terrible coward," Warren stated, his voice trembling heavily but ringing with absolute, undeniable conviction. "I allowed a woman to completely isolate me and rewrite my entire reality because I was completely terrified of facing my own grief. I chose the absolute comfort of an easy, quiet lie over the difficult reality of trusting my own flesh and blood. My own cowardice gave that woman the exact fertile ground she needed to destroy my family." He turned and looked directly into my eyes. The entire courtroom fell entirely silent. At my corporate retirement party, I pushed my daughter to the floor. My father confessed. heavy tears finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. I pointed at the chair beside me and told everyone in the room that the seat belonged to my real daughter, referring to the young woman who was actively robbing me blind. I want to correct that permanently on the public record right now. Sophia Whitaker is my real daughter. She is my only daughter. And she is the only person on this earth that I owe a massive apology that I can never, ever repay with money. The emotional completion of those words hit me like a massive physical wave. It was the exact, perfect inverse of the brutal public humiliation he had subjected me to days earlier. It was a complete, undeniable validation of my existence, spoken clearly under oath in front of the law. The judge did not need any further deliberation. He immediately struck his gavel, issuing a permanent legal injunction that completely halted the forced foreclosure sale of the house. He entirely voided the fraudulent transfer on death designation, restoring the property rights back to their original state. Then, the judge formally transferred the entire case file to the district attorney for a comprehensive civil and criminal fraud investigation. Celeste was not dragged out of the courtroom screaming in theatrical handcuffs like a villain in a cheap movie. Real life is significantly colder than that. She was simply told to remain seated as the bailiffs surrounded her table. She was completely pulled down into a terrifying reality of severe legal consequences, total financial ruin, and the absolute permanent destruction of her high society reputation. Her life in Wilmington was entirely over. We walked out into the bright morning sun, but the battle was not magically resolved with a simple hug on the courthouse steps. I did not throw my arms around my father's neck and pretend that a single legal victory instantly erased 3 agonizing years of deep psychological wounds. I offered him something much smaller, but incredibly more honest. I gave him the opportunity to prove himself through time. I told him I needed consistent, answered phone calls. I needed genuine presence. I needed him to actively rebuild the solid foundation he had allowed to rot away. He accepted those terms with overwhelming gratitude. His very first act of complete financial freedom was to take a massive portion of his newly secured corporate retirement bonus and formally establish the Eleanor Whitaker Preservation Scholarship. It was a substantial fund dedicated entirely to helping young architectural students protect historical foundations in our city. Immediately after, he worked closely with Daniel to restructure the old wooden house into an ironclad legal trust, permanently locking every single loophole that Celeste had ever exploited. Exactly 6 weeks later, the warm coastal wind blew gently through the old historic neighborhood. I stood alone on the cracked concrete driveway. I reached deep into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the heavy, tarnished brass key. It was the exact same key that had fallen from my hands and slid across the polished floor of the grand ballroom. I walked up the wooden steps, slid the brass key into the front door lock, and turned it. The familiar, comforting click echoed loudly in the quiet afternoon. I turned around and looked out at the old wooden front porch. The heavy swinging bench was still missing, but in its place sat 4 sturdy, newly crafted wooden chairs. 1 chair for me, 1 chair for Daniel, 1 chair for Aunt Vivian, and 1 chair for my father. There was absolutely no chair left for the usurper. There was only space for truth, shared memory, and the people who actually belonged. True revenge does not always require physical violence or loud, chaotic screaming matches. Sometimes, the most brutal, absolute revenge is simply taking every single dark, whispered lie and forcing it to burn completely away under the blinding, undeniable light of the truth. Thank you so much for listening to this story with me today. Please leave a comment below telling me exactly where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And make sure to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.